Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. And this paper that I'm discussing really did an excellent job of covering the issues. And they clearly discuss the impact of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's Monetary Trends and Cycles project at the NBER. And this 40-year project, as they said, was built on the creation of a new monetary aggregate database. And it had an ever-increasing impact on monetary economics and monetary policy. And it made as John mentioned at the end, it made the case for the role of monetary forces in precipitating inflation and the business cycle. And again, as they say, a monetary history of the United States, 1963, was and still is the star attraction of the project. And in a sense, what Paul Volcker did in 1979 was, even though he didn't directly do it, but he followed the prescriptions that ended the Great Inflation. Okay, so, and the key legacies of a monetary history, according to Emmy and John, were the narrative approach as a method to identify a link between changes in money, the money supply, and the economy. And secondly, that the project laid the key foundations of modern monetary economics. What comes out is, in the long run, there's the neutrality of money. In the short run, the changes in money over the business cycle affect real output, and they affect real output because of nominal rigidities. But there are other important legacies that I would throw in. One's the importance of monetary policy, in a sense, as they said. The view that money didn't matter, well, basically what Friedman and Schwartz did was say that money did matter. Again, another issue is the destabilizing effects of discretionary policies on the importance of rules. This is a key theme that comes out of their work. But what I want to do is, I want to focus on two things. One is, I'll say a little bit more about the data analysis and a little bit more about the process by which Friedman and Schwartz, in a sense, convince the public. So it really goes back to Anna Schwartz's work. As I said, I was really fortunate to work with her for many decades. And she began her data work in 1936 in a book by Arthur Geyer and Walt Rostow called The Growth and Fluctuations of the British Economy, 1790 to 1850. This was published in 1953. And the book was based on NBER techniques, so it was a predecessor to what came out. It was not an NBER book, but it was using the Burns and Mitchell techniques. Remember, Anna was a student of Arthur Burns. And she switched her attention in 1940 to the United States, and she began working on the U.S. monetary data. And she wrote a paper with Emma Oliver, who was another researcher at the Bureau back then. And it was published in 1947. And she did these estimates of currency held by the public, vault cash, and treasury cash. That was the basis for the collection of monetary statistics, which was in Monetary Statistics of the United States in 1970. And that underlay the books and articles of the entire NBER process. So this is a very big, very comprehensive and detailed data project that sort of underlie everything. And this is the essence of what the NBER is all about. My second comment is, I call it the struggle. So, Emmy and John talk about, how can we believe today how people thought back then, and now today we think that money matters, and back then they didn't. Well, in a sense, it took a long time for this view, for the Friedman and Schwartz and what's called the monetarist view, to gain some traction. And it was tied up with this debate that people forgot about, pretty well forgotten about, but which really dominated the profession from the 1960s up into the 80s. It was the debate between the monetarists and the Keynesians. And the monetary analysis in the NBER project was part of a larger body of work pioneered by Milton Friedman on the modern quantity theory of money. And later this was called monetarism. He didn't come up with the idea that I think it came from Karl Brunner, but there may be other origins. And so what he did in the modern quantity theory of money in 1956, okay, he challenged the prevailing Keynesian orthodoxy that money did not matter. And then there were a series of papers that were written by Friedman, okay, which were sort of behind everything. And one was a monetary and fiscal framework for monetary stability in the AER, where he kind of laid out the origins of his monetary rule. And then the second paper was called Price and Monetary Changes in Three Wartime. So here he compares what happened in the Civil War, World War I and World War II. But the methodology that he set up was the narrative approach that's later in a monetary history. Okay, and then a program for monetary stability where he lays out his famous monetary rule. So these were the foundations. And then Friedman, Schwartz, Phil Kagan, Meiselman, and other people who were mostly NBER scholars, they then took on the Keynesian orthodoxy in direct combat, and that raged through the 1960s. And the key Keynesian antagonists were James Tobin of the Yale School, Franco Modigliani and Paul Samuelson at MIT, and Lawrence Klein of Penn. And they had a strong influence on the staff at the Federal Reserve. Okay, so in a sense, Friedman were taking on the establishment. Now, as Emmy and John mentioned, a key part of the debate and a key sort of takeaway we always have of a monetary history is Chapter 7 on the Great Contraction of 1929 to 33, where they argued that the Fed, in a sense, caused the downturn by tight monetary policy in 1928, and then they allowed the recession to turn into the Depression by not following lender of last resort that the Fed had been established to do to offset the banking panics. So, as Emmy and John said, Peter Temin, in a sense, challenged this view, and he argued that the collapse in money was really an endogenous response to the collapse of autonomous consumption. There was considerable debate on this. In a sense, it was resolved in the 80s on the side of Friedman and Schwartz, but now it's come back again. There's new papers by a new generation that's bringing up fiscal and other issues. So it's not totally gone. But in a sense, it's the great inflation itself, which the monetarists attributed to the Fed accommodation of growing fiscal deficits by successive administrations in the 60s and 70s, that led to the ascendancy of the Friedman-Schwartz approach. And it led, and I talk about this in my comment, is the Fed beginning to track monetary aggregates in the 50s into the 60s, and then they adopt monetary targeting after 1970. This, of course, came through with through the Congress mandating that they do this. Okay, so while the profession increasingly accepted the Friedman-Schwartz interpretation of the Great Inflation, the Fed didn't follow through with the requisite tight monetary policies. And they did this for largely political reasons. And as is well known, fear of output losses and rising unemployment associated with the disinflation that would really be needed to get rid of the inflation, that prompted both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon in their own time to pressure the Fed chairs not to tighten. So it's something very similar to what we're experiencing today. So as Emmy and John explained, it took Volcker, who was not a monetarist, to follow the tight monetary policies that came from the Friedman and Schwartz playbook. So the debate continued into the 70s. And the key issues there were, one was the black box, that Friedman and Schwartz, they never wrote down a model of the economy, of the monetary, and the second was the role of monetary aggregates. And Friedman and Schwartz lost both battles. The ISLM model was heavily criticized, and in a sense, Friedman gave up on that, and the Fed abandoned monetary targets in the late 1970s. But in the end, Friedman and Schwartz did win the war. Their work was key in cementing the notion that inflation is the responsibility of monetary policy, and the influence of monetary policy is powerful at the cyclical frequency. And the research in this big project created the key pillars of modern monetary economics and central bank practice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.